I'm Leslie Maitland, chair of the Amram Scholar Series, and today it is my honor to present our first speaker of the new year, Jamie Bernstein, whose poignantly intimate family memoir, Famous Father Girl, invites us to experience her extraordinary childhood as the daughter of composer and conductor Leonard Bernstein, one of the most influential and glittering celebrities of the 20th century. Published to coincide with the centennial of her father's birth in 1918, Jamie's book shares a tender and bravely honest view of her complicated and sublimely charismatic daddy, a musical genius who was chief conductor of the New York Philharmonic, the composer of West Side Story and countless other marvels, a repeat Emmy Award-winning television star, a teacher, and a humanitarian. Her story of the bubbling creative cauldron of New York City in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s presents the seductive maestro as a chief wizard of that world, with his lovely wife and 3 children often overpowered not only by his ego and madcap energy, but also by his ardent and demanding entourage. As described by The New Yorker, Jamie grew up wriggling inside a paradox, struggling to become a self, when so much of her was defined by her brilliant parent. Her memoir provides a startling inside view, encompassing family love, Jewish American style, with all its glories and corrosions. No one lives easily on the slopes of a volcano. Jamie Bernstein has been faithful to her unease. The New York Times similarly hailed her account as wry and wonderful. And amid other praise was this, a warning not to read her book on the subway, lest one miss one stop. Personally, I found it so mesmerizing that I would have taken it with me into the shower if only I had known how to keep the pages dry. In short, it's a terrific read, a trip around the globe with a fascinating set of famous characters. And always at the center, LB, dancing with the demons of drugs, cigarettes, alcohol, and adulterous gay sex, while simultaneously devoted to his family and his art. In his often oppressive shadow, Jamie Bernstein, his eldest child, tells us she grew up yearning to become a rock star. She went on to build a lifelong love of music into a career, sharing her knowledge and excitement. Inspired by her father's innate impulse to teach, she communicates her enthusiasm for orchestral music as a writer, concert narrator, broadcaster, and filmmaker. Beginning 15 years ago with the Bernstein Beat, a family concert modeled on her father's groundbreaking young people's concerts, Jamie continues to design, write, and narrate concerts and speak on music for worldwide audiences of all ages. She has produced and hosted shows for radio, including live performances of the New York Philharmonic and programs from Tanglewood. Her prize-winning film documentary, Crescendo, The Power of Music, focuses on impoverished children whose participation in youth orchestra programs fosters social transformation. And in addition to other writing, she edits Prelude, Fugue, and Riffs, a newsletter focused on her father's legacy. Jamie Bernstein comes to us today in cooperation with the Jewish Book Council. And now, because the sound of a cell phone in the middle of a lecture is never music to our ears, I urge you to silence yours. Thank you very much.
How's this? It works. Hi. Thank you, Leslie, so much. And thank you all for coming out on this January morning. I'm thrilled to see so many of you here. And I always love coming down to this part of the world where I've been ever so many times, mostly thanks to my dad, who was down here a lot back in the day. Okay, so what I thought I would do today is first I'll tell you a little bit about how this book came into existence, and then I'll tell you what my intentions were in writing the book, and then I'll give you a little sort of thumbnail sketch of the contents of the book, which I hope will whet your appetite to read it all yourselves, or you have the option of hearing me do the audiobook. So if you're not tired of my voice by the end of this presentation, you can hear it some more on the audiobook. And then all of that will include a couple of clips if our audio and video behave. And then all of that will still leave us some question and answer time at the end. And I'm certain you'll have questions because I can't cover everything in the time I allot myself. So that gives you a chance to fill in the gaps yourselves. Okay, so that's the plan. Sound okay? Okay, here we go. So this book thing began about 4 years ago by now. I should say, first of all, that all my life I was a scribbler. I've always been writing something, you know, poetry and lyrics and journal entries and all that kind of stuff, but I never ever thought I could write a whole book. I just didn't think I had it in me to pull it off. I didn't have the confidence. So even in a bookstore, I wouldn't allow myself to have the fantasy while looking at the shelves that, gee, maybe one day I could have a book up there. No, can't think about that because it's never going to happen. So that is why, to this very day, now the book's been out a year and a half or more, every time I see a pile of my books at events like this, my knees buckle with amazement that I actually put this book out in the world. I didn't think I could ever do it. So it's still very exciting. So 4 years ago, I ran into an acquaintance who was a book agent. And I was telling him in this complete sort of cocktail party, meaningless way about these notions I had about ways you might do a memoir that was multimedia. I just had these ideas. And he said, oh, that's interesting. Well, why don't you come to my office and we'll talk about it further? I thought, yeah, this is nothing, but okay, fine. So I went to his office and I told him all my little multimedia ideas. And he said, well, I don't know about that multimedia part, but I will tell you that if you write a memoir and you key it into your dad and it comes out during his centennial year, you're gonna sell a couple of books. It was a completely pragmatic observation, but it was like he shot me out of a cannon. And I realized, oh my God, he's right. This is it. This is the moment. This is the time. And it was the right time for me personally also for a number of reasons. And so I literally ran home from that meeting and started writing the book that very afternoon. And I threw out everything I wrote that day, but at least I had started the process. And then this gentleman did in fact become my agent, and he sold the book to HarperCollins, who subsequently published it. So that went well, and actually the experience of writing the book was great. I was very worried. I didn't know what to expect because I knew that in today's publishing world, it ain't like in the olden days. And you don't get the same degree of attention and you know, punctiliousness that the editorial process used to provide back in the day. So I don't know about you, but you know, when I read books that are published today, you find all these typos and grammatical errors and editing messes, and like in every book I read, I just, everything is riddled with this stuff. So I didn't know what to expect, but I got very lucky. I was assigned a marvelous editor. He was half my age, but he was incredibly rigorous, and he really pushed me. And I kind of liked being pushed. There was one point, I think I brought in like the 4th draft, which my editor, Jonathan, read. And then he called me into his office, you know, like the principal. And I sat there quivering, oh, did he like it? And he said, well, you've given me an A-. I want you to go back and give me an A. And you know, nobody in my whole life ever talked to me like that. Not a teacher, not a parent, nobody ever gave me that extra push. And I kind of liked that. So I went back and I honed and I polished and I cut. That was the worst part, was the cutting. And I guess this always happens when you write a book, but I had so many good stories from, you know, the course of my life, and I wanted to tell them all. But Jonathan correctly observed that if you have too many, as he called them, bits, If you have too many little bits, you slow down the forward momentum of your narrative. And you want people to keep turning the pages. You want them to miss their subway stop, you know? That would be the ultimate compliment, is if someone got so absorbed in the book that they would forget where they are. And I knew he was right, so I cut, and it was very painful. But I did what I had to do, and it was definitely for the best. Because when I did get these feedbacks after the book was in the world, that people couldn't put the book down, and that they, you know, it filled up their whole plane ride, or that, you know, whatever, all these wonderful things that people say, it indicated to me that Jonathan, my editor, was correct, and that he really helped my book be a better thing in this world. So that whole process was very gratifying. And then the whole business of sharing my book in the world has been fantastic. The Jewish Book Council has been my best friend. And I've done a lot of presentations, not unlike the one we're having right here today. And HarperCollins itself didn't do so much in the promotion department. That's the nature of publishing today. But they did say, you know, you should really audition for the Jewish Book Council. You have to audition. And the audition is like speed dating. They put 50 authors in a room, and each one gets 2 minutes, and only 2 minutes, to give their spiel. So you get up and you talk about your book for 2 minutes, sit down. Next author gets up, 2 minutes, sits down. The next author gets up, 2 minutes, until all 50 have gone by. And on the basis of this, all these JCCs and libraries and Hadassah groups and whatever Jewish organizations around the country decide which authors they would like to book. And HarperCollins had said, you should audition because you're really going to get 10 or 15 presentations out of this. Well, I got 50 in the first year. Then the book came out in paperback this past June, and I got another 25. And what I gradually came to realize was that I was talking to my father's core fan base. You guys, you were probably there. I mean, how many of you went to concerts and actually saw my father conduct in real life? Look at all the hands. How many of you watched him on TV? Look at all the hands. How many of you know some of his Broadway shows or saw them? Look at the hands. Bought his records. I rest my case. So that's why, over time, it has been unbelievably gratifying and touching to talk to these audiences one after another, because I began to feel like all the energy my father put into the world comes pinging back at me from audiences like yourselves. So it's been an incredibly delightful experience to share my book with audiences like yourselves. So anyway, what I was intending to do by writing this book was a number of things. First and foremost, I wanted to answer the question that I'm always asked, as are my brother and sister, by journalists and people in general. What was it like? What was it like to grow up in your family with that larger-than-life person for a father? So my short answer for the journalist is, well, it wasn't boring. But the longer answer is my book. And that's why there was a book to write, because it wasn't a boring story. So there was a lot to talk about. But also, I wanted to paint a picture of the times I was growing up in. They were very consequential, turbulent, transitional times in the United States. I was a teenager in the 1960s, basically, and a college student, and then a young person in my 20s during the 1970s. And those were an incredible time in which to be a young person in this country. Everything was changing. And especially if you were a woman, there were a lot of things that were changing very fast, and it was often very confusing, but it was incredibly exciting times, as clearly all of you know and remember. So I wanted to paint a portrait of that, not just to remind those who lived through it of what it was like, but also to describe it for younger readers who weren't there and might be curious to know what life was like in the US in the second half of the 20th century. Because there are many things that are different now from the way they were back then. Just to give you one example, smoking cigarettes. when I was growing up, everybody smoked. All the grown-ups smoked. It was weird if a grown-up didn't smoke. Like, why are they so dweeby that they don't smoke cigarettes? And in my household, both my parents smoked like chimneys. And every flat surface in every room had an ashtray on it. And at the dinner table, everybody had their own individual ashtray in front of their plate. And there were cups of cigarettes on either end of the table so that everybody could smoke between courses. Somewhere in my book, I say, I think my parents would have smoked while chewing if they could have. So it was ubiquitous. And I myself couldn't wait to be a smoker because it would be so elegant, and the way that cigarette elongated your arm and made you feel so soigné and grown up, and it accentuated all your gestures, and it was just going to be the coolest thing in the world to be a smoker. And of course, everything around us encouraged us to think that. Movies and advertising, and it was a completely dyed-in-the-wool thing in the United States that smoking was cool. And it took a long time to get over that, and we are over it, and I'm so relieved that when I go into a restaurant or a bar or a movie theater or an airplane or a train or a car, I don't get assaulted by that horrible gray stink that we all lived with. Remember when you'd go home after you'd been out in some restaurant or pub and your clothes would smell so horrible you just have to throw them right in the hamper? So I don't miss that at all. But anyway, so I thread through the book quite a lot of references to smoking and to cigarettes, and this turns out to be germane to my story because both my parents died of lung cancer. So there you go. So that's just one example of the many things that have changed over the decades since the time I grew up. And then I gather this happens to authors, and it definitely happened to me, that sometimes as you're writing your book, you discover something else that it's about. And I was about 3/4 of the way through my first draft when it suddenly hit me that what my story was really about was how I made my peace with music. And I'll tell you more about this later, but it did turn out that this was a big theme in my story. And of course, that's a kind of narrative for making peace with my own dad. So that was another thing that this book turned out to be about. Okay, so now I will kind of take you through the book in this thumbnail way. And first of all, I should explain about the title, Famous Father Girl. So in 2nd grade, my classmate Lisa used to tease me by calling me Famous Father Girl. That was her little nickname for me. And so I decided that would be a good title. And the reason I chose it is, first of all, it's like a little rude. It kind of pokes you in the eye. So I liked that. And I also liked that it's completely uncoy. It tells you exactly what this book is about. And I liked that about it too. Because my whole way of storytelling is very straightforward. I'm just going to tell you exactly how I remember it and what I felt about it. And I often make this joke about myself that I was born missing the gene for guile. I don't think I could write fiction because all I can do is tell it the way I saw it or remember it. So that's what I did. And I told my brother and sister, the three of us are very close, and I told them from the get-go that I was going to show them every draft that I wrote, and that they had total veto power over the book, and that if there was anything in there that they did not like or that they thought was incorrect, I would either correct it or I would take it out. Whatever they wanted, I would do. And in the end, they were incredibly supportive, and they basically gave me the green light and said, it's okay, tell it the way you're telling it, it's good. And that was a huge vote of confidence because really my brother and sister, they're my most important relationship in my life. And so that has to be okay before anything else happens. So that went well. So anyway, the book is chronological. So it begins with my earliest memories, which, not surprisingly, coincide with the birth of my brother Alexander. I was the firstborn, that meant that I had about 2.5 years of being the total focus of attention. I was the golden girl, and everybody made a tremendous fuss over me. And then all of a sudden there was this froggy little baby who was, pulling focus away from the golden girl, and I was not so happy about that at first. But once my brother could talk, I realized he wasn't so much a competitor as a companion. And now I had somebody to go through life with that, could help me process this whirlwind of craziness going on all around us all the time. And then later on, our sister Nina was born. But in those first 9 years of my life, it was just Alexander and me navigating the turbulent waters of our parents' crazy lives and all the people in their lives. So in those early days, we lived in a building on the corner of 57th Street and 7th Avenue in New York, an old building called the Osborne, great old building. And once I was about 5 years old, and my father took over the New York Philharmonic, he had the world's greatest commute, because right across the street was Carnegie Hall. So that was very convenient. But in those early years, my brother and I shared a bedroom. And we would go to sleep most nights to the sound of the grown-ups carrying on downstairs. We could clearly hear them, screaming with laughter over their word games and their charades, or roaring songs around the piano. We knew our dad was sitting at the piano and everybody was clustered around him, and they were all, singing whatever they were singing, show tunes or maybe Brahms. I don't know what they were singing, but it was just this gigantic racket of grown-ups having a great time downstairs. That's what we thought grown-ups did exclusively, was just to have fun, play games, and sing and laugh and carry on. So that was kind of our nightly lullaby that Alexander and I went to sleep listening to. And the house was generally full of people because everybody loved coming over to our house. Not just because our dad was so engaging and charismatic and hilarious and full of energy and fun, but also because of our mother, Felicia Montealegre. She was born in South America. She was from Chile, and an actress and also a very accomplished pianist. And she was so beautiful and so naturally elegant, but she also had this quick wit. She was so quick on the trigger and funny and delicious, and she was just a person that her friends adored. She was adored by all our family friends. So, and she also had this incredible eye for design. So our house was always beautiful and elegant but comfortable. Like, it was always okay to hook your knee over the arm of the sofa. You could really feel Hamish in our house. And also, my mother always made sure we had a South American cook. So the food was great in our house too. So what with one thing and another, it was everybody over to Lenny and Felicia's as often as possible. And so our house was always full of people. And these people. So early on in the book, I have the sentence, "Let the name dropping begin." Because really, they were quite extraordinary. I mean, there we were in the middle of the 20th century at the epicenter of culture in the United States, in New York City, in the 50s and 60s, and then later the 70s and 80s. Those were incredible times to be surrounded by the cultural luminaries. And so, to name drop a little bit, we had all the greats in classical music, of course. Isaac Stern was a very close friend of the family, but also we had so many people in theater, and my father did so much work in theater, so his collaborators alone, who were his friends as well, were remarkable. So Jerome Robbins and Steve Sondheim, Betty Comden, Adolph Green, Lillian Hellman. There were all these incredible collaborators. And then there were people in the movies too. There was our very close friend, Betty Bacall. She was Betty Persky from the Bronx, you do know. But then when she got to Hollywood, they changed her name to Lauren Bacall, and to us she was Betty Bacall. So she was around all the time. And Richard Avedon, the photographer, Mike Nichols, was my godfather, actually. So it was like that. And they were wonderful people. And you know, when you're a little kid, you don't know who your parents' friends are. They're just your parents' friends. You're too young to have any sense of context for who your parents' friends are. So it was only later on when I got older that I realized that they were quite an extraordinary bunch. But as kids, they were just our parents' fun friends, and they were very nice to us. So we loved them. And we loved listening to them carrying on, and we just couldn't wait to grow up and be just like them and just have fun all the time. And really, that's how it seemed to me until one exact day. And that exact day was November 22nd, 1963, the day President Kennedy was assassinated. And so later that day, all the friends came over to our house like usual, but now they were all crying. And you know, I don't really think I ever saw grown-ups cry until that day. And then all of a sudden, they were all crying. And that was deeply disturbing, very upsetting to see all the grown-ups sad. So that was the day when I realized, boy, maybe this whole being a grown-up thing is a little more complicated than I thought. And then, weirdly, just a couple of months after that most terrible day for my parents and their contemporaries, came the most wonderful day for me and my contemporaries, and that day was the day that the Beatles came to the United States and went on the Ed Sullivan Show. Oh my God. It is very hard for me to convey to you what a Beatlemaniac I was. They were my ground of being, like air to a bird or water to a fish. They were the reason I woke up in the morning and the reason that I went to sleep at night, so I could dream about them, which I did regularly. They were just everything to me. And very fortunately for me, my father loved the Beatles too. I mean, he wasn't obsessed with them like I was, but he really loved their music. He thought they were so melodic and musically inventive and, you know, full of interesting things. And so one of the best things in my childhood was sharing Beatles albums with my dad. So the minute a new Beatles album came out, I would run straight to the record store. Remember record stores? And I would buy the new album, and I'd go running home and go barging straight into my father's studio. We barged in there all the time. He was very nice about letting us interrupt him. We never felt unwelcome in his presence, ever, really. Daddy, Daddy, I got Rubber Soul. And he would say, great, let's put it on right now. So we'd put it on his turntable and then sit down together with the album cover on our laps. Remember album covers? How nice and big and handsome they were? And then we would listen to the music. So the thing about my father was that he could never, ever turn off the teacher faucet. He was compulsive. He referred to himself as a compulsive rabbi. And really, for us, it was more like a teacher fire hose because it was constant. So we're listening to the Beatles album, and he's telling us about the music as it's going by. So when we got to, say, Norwegian Wood, we're listening to Norwegian Wood, and he says, hey, you hear that instrument? That's a sitar. Do you know what a sitar is? No, I didn't know what a sitar was. Well, it's this stringed instrument from India. It's like a big oversized guitar and has a lot of strings, and the tunings are very peculiar and very specific. And every song has a special scale called a raga. And, you know, pretty soon I'm learning a lot about music. Another time in the car. And in the car station, very interested in music. That was the whole thing about him, knocking down the barriers between different genres of music. And in his own composing and in his own presenting about music, he was just so holistic about music. So we always listened to pop music in the car. He'd turn on the radio and say, let's catch up. He always wanted to know what everybody was listening to. So one time, You Really Got Me by the Kinks came on the radio, and it was a song we all really loved. Remember it? Da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, girl, you really got me going. You got me so I can't sleep at night. Da-da-da-da-da. Oh, we loved that song. So we're listening to it and singing along, and suddenly my father says, "Hey, you know, this song is in the Mixolydian mode. Do you know what a mode is?" No, we didn't know what a mode was. So then he proceeded to explain about how there are all these different scales with Greek names that you can generate by starting on different white notes of the piano. And the minute we got home, he said, "Come to the piano, I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you." And he started showing us all these different ancient scales that you can generate just by starting on different white notes and staying on the white notes. And so, okay, that was pretty interesting. And then, just a few months later, what do you suppose the next Young People's Concert was about? Modes! And when he got to the Mixolydian mode, he walked over to the piano and he sat down and he played and sang "You Really Got Me." And the kids loved it in the audience. And he rapidly figured out that by using pop music examples to illustrate the topics that he was sharing with his audiences, it really helped maintain the kids' focus on what he was talking about. So now I'm going to show you a clip. I hope it works and I hope you can hear it. That is another instance from a Young People's Concert. I hope this works.
Now let's see how this simple little construction grows in size when it's used in a slightly larger song form, say a modern popular song. In fact, most pop tunes stick to this ABA pattern very strictly. The only difference here, and this is important as you'll see later, is that usually the first A section is repeated right away before the B section comes, so that the pattern is really A-A-B-A instead of just ABA. But it's still made out of those same three parts, ABA, only the first part is played twice in a row. That's not hard. Let's take a pop tune. In fact, let's take a typical Beatles tune and see what happens. Here first, there's an A section. I give her all my love, that's all I do. And if you saw my love, you'd love her too. I love her. That's A, all right? That's once. Now what happens? That A section is repeated exactly the same. She gives me everything, and tenderly, and so on, right down to, and I love her. That's the end of the repeated A section, right? Right. Now comes the contrasting B section. A love like ours could never die. I think that's how it goes. As long as I have you near me. That's the B. And that brings us back again to the original A section in all its glory. Bright are the stars that shine, dark is the night, and so on, right to the end of the piece. Well,
Okay.
Now let's see how this simple little construction grows in size
Thank you.
when it's used in a slightly larger song form, say a modern popular.
Oh, thank you. Isn't that cute? Come on. It's adorable. And did you notice how elegantly dressed all the kids were in the audience? So from another era, right? Really fun. So you're probably wondering at this point, well, what about music for us kids at home? Did we have piano lessons? Why, yes, we did have piano lessons. And all three of us had kind of bad attitudes about our piano lessons. We didn't really like them, and we never practiced except in that sickening half hour before the piano teacher arrived at the house. Then I would run to the piano and like, oh, what was I supposed to have mastered by now, except I haven't thought about it all week. And then I would try to, it was hopeless. Gornisht helfen. So the problem, of course, was that I was surrounded by music being performed at its optimum all the time, all around me. So when I sat down at the piano, I just was overcome with this sense of hopelessness. Like, who am I kidding? I'll never get there, and it's just useless, and why am I bothering? And this is just an exercise in futility. So I had a very bad attitude. Luckily, I had gone to a day camp where for a month they lent us these little folk guitars. And the counselor taught us 3 chords, A, E, and the very difficult to play B seventh. But with those 3 chords, we were taught the song Easy Rider. And so, of course, I ran home and said, Daddy, Daddy, look what I can play. I can play Easy Rider on the guitar. So I played him my little song, and then my father said, oh, well, you know, that's a blues. Do you know what a blues is? No, I didn't know what a blues was. So he proceeded to explain about how the blues song pattern always stays the same, and the chords go 1, 4, 1, 5, 4, 1, and has this very specific form. And he explained about tonic, subdominant, and dominant, and just telling me those little bits about a blues progression, it was like the Rosetta Stone for all the music on the radio. And I suddenly began to understand how songs were being put together melodically. And then I found a guitar in the closet that somebody had given my father, a classical guitar, but I didn't care. I restrung it and I tuned it up just like they taught me at day camp. And then I had my own guitar. And that was a path to making music something of my own. And I started playing the songs that I heard on the radio. I could even play Beatles songs and play with my friends, and it just became something of my own. And that made music fun for me for the first time. And then finally at age 16, I quit my piano lessons, and then I just started playing the piano for fun and writing songs. So I was writing songs on the piano and on the guitar, getting a lot of attention for it. I wrote a whole show for my father's 50th birthday, a kind of roast, where all the songs were making fun of him, and I performed it in front of all those amazing friends at his 50th birthday party. Looking back on it, I just can't believe I had the chutzpah to do that, but that is what I did. So I was getting a lot of attention. Then I went to college, and the bottom fell out of all of it. I had never switched schools before. I went to the same girls' school for 13 years, and I'd never left home before. And now I was at Harvard University, where it was this gigantic, overwhelming, confusing environment, and I totally did not know who I was anymore. And I had a very rough time of it there. I was very lonely and insecure, and I was finally making some friends and starting to have some fun by the time my junior year began. And then, guess what happened in my junior year? Who came to the Harvard campus to develop and deliver the Charles Eliot Norton Lecture Series? Leonard Bernstein. And so, you know, it's not highly recommended to have your parent on the campus with you when you're an undergraduate. That's very confusing. So at that moment, any hopes I had of figuring out who I was independent of my last name were dashed permanently. Because, you know, there he was front and center. And so it was, on the other hand, very exciting that he was giving these lectures. He was basically opening up a brand new field of inquiry that had never been addressed before. He was comparing elements of music and tonality with Chomskyan linguistics. It was a completely new idea, and he was in way over his head and having the absolute time of his life. And the research was gigantic. So by the end of my junior year, he hadn't finished writing the lectures yet, so he came back in my senior year. So there was no getting rid of him. But, you know, it was all very exciting. And he had this young assistant, Tom, who was helping him with this massive research that he was undertaking. And Tom was very clever, brilliant, in fact, and engaging and witty, and my father really loved Tom. I mean, my father fell in love with Tom. So by my senior year, at that point, my brother is now a freshman. So Alexander and I are both on the Harvard campus, and we're hearing all these rumors about Lenny and Tom. And they're sort of sharing this dorm spaced at the top of Quincy House. And so, you know, we're hearing all these rumors, but every time we go home, everything seems kind of normal. So that was very confusing, okay? So now, I'm going to take you quickly through 4 years of circumstances that started the day after I graduated from Harvard in June of 1974. And the day after, I'm home, and my mother sits me down to tell me that they have found a cancerous mass in her breast, and she's going in for a mastectomy. Now, this was 1974. This was before pink ribbons, before Betty Ford, before any of that. And in those days, people still did not talk about breast cancer. It was this shameful, awful, mortifying, fearsome thing. And my mother was such an intensely private person. So for her, it was particularly horrible that she had to go through this thing that she could barely talk about. She couldn't even tell our sister Nina at first what she was about to undergo. So at first she told Nina that she was going to the hospital because the doctor was going to take a little thing off her nose. That was the best she could do at first. And then later on she called Nina from the hospital after the surgery and said, "Oh, it was the funniest thing. The doctor went to take a thing off my nose, and then he decided to take off something else too." Can you imagine? Nina at the time was 11. So it was tough. My mother made a pretty good recovery, but you know, there was no reconstructive surgery either back then. So it was all very tough, and she was only 52. So all of this was very hard on our family, but we somehow got through it, and my mother made a good recovery. And then exactly 2 years later, that's summer of '76, my father went to my mother and said, "You know, for the month of August, I think I'm just going to spend that month in Northern California with Tom." And my mother said, "Oh yeah? Well, why don't you just not come back then?" And my father said, "Okay, I won't." And all of a sudden, my parents were separated, and my father was living with a man. And again, this was a situation that nobody had a vocabulary for all the way back then. Now we do. That's not to say that such a situation would be easy today. It would never be easy, but at least these are things that we can talk about openly and have seen in our culture, and it's been discussed, and there are books and there are movies, and like, you know, this is a thing that is not a secret shame anymore. But back then, it was very difficult. Plus, my father's mother, Jenny Bernstein, was still very much alive and living in Brookline, Massachusetts. And how exactly was he planning to explain all of this to her? She having come from Ukraine at the age of 8 and was still very much, you know, from the old world and everything. So what with one thing and the other, this was a very hard situation for my father to sustain. And the relationship with Tom did not endure. They were vastly different and very different in age, and it just lost momentum. And so in the course of that year, my father and mother started making this gradual rapprochement. And by golly, about a year later, the following summer of '77, my parents, they seemed to be back together. And we were all so relieved. This was so great. We were united as a family, and summer was beginning, and we were all together in our country house in Connecticut doing all our family things, you know, swimming and tennis and word games and yummy dinners and everybody together. My mother was coughing a lot, though, but it was just, we were all so happy about this reunion. Then in July, she went in for a test to find out why she was coughing so much. And the cancer had metastasized to her lungs. And exactly 1 year later, she was gone. She died at the age of 56. My sister Nina was only 16. Could you possibly think of a worse age at which to lose your mother? But we were all shattered, as you can imagine. And my father was shattered the most because he felt somehow responsible, guilty, that he had somehow exacerbated the whole situation, that somehow he made things worse, and you know, he was overwhelmed with guilt. So that was a very rough 4 years for our family, as you can imagine. And it took a while for us to find ourselves as a family again. And we did, because we were just so interconnected. And my father and his brother and sister were so incredibly close. They even had a secret language. So they were the perfect template for my brother and sister and me to learn how to be incredibly close. So those two sets of trios really helped reassemble the family dynamic. And so, meanwhile, Nina, of course, has to finish high school. And so we all stayed very close to her in New York. But the minute she went off to Harvard, then everybody felt like there was more mobility. And believe it or not, I had gone back to that songwriting stuff. And I decided, perhaps not wisely, to go out to LA and pursue a career as a singer-songwriter. You know, I'm not sure this was the best decision I ever made. You know, I was writing okay songs and everything, but when it came to performing, I was such a mess. In the book, I describe it as having one foot on the gas and the other foot on the brake simultaneously. I was driving myself crazy, and I worried about everything. I worried that, you know, my fingers would stumble on the piano keys. I worried that my fingers would slip off the frets of the guitar. I worried that I would forget my lyrics. I worried that I would sing off key. And therefore, all those things happened. Because really, you know, if you worry enough about things, you can manifest them in the world. So I was kind of a mess about this music making. But in the end, incredibly enough, I did get my record deal. And I made my recording, and I handed it into the record company, and they listened to it, and they announced that they didn't like it, and they weren't going to release it. The end. After 3 years of effort, it all landed in the wastebasket. So that was very discouraging. Fortunately, I had just gotten married, and I was crazy about my husband, David, and I thought, you know, the hell with this music thing. I'm just gonna throw myself into my marriage and my wonderful husband, and maybe we'll start a family. And we did. First, we had our daughter, Frankie, who was born in 1987, and then we had our son, Evan, who was born on October 14th, 1989. Then, weirdly, on his first birthday, October 14th, 1990, my father died. So October 14th is my annual short circuit day, because really I would prefer to just be quiet and contemplative, but it's Evan's birthday, and, you know, party and celebrate, and so that's been an ongoing struggle. But anyway, the minute my father died, my brother and sister and I suddenly found ourselves saddled with this new job that we had never thought about for a second in advance. And that job, of course, was being the caretakers of our father's legacy. Legacy, we never thought about his legacy while he was alive. He was just daddy. And we just did all the daddy things with him, you know, eating corn on the cob and playing anagrams and tagging along on his tours, and going to his concerts, of course, was great. All that good stuff. But we never really thought about taking care of what he would leave behind after he was gone. There was a staff, he had a company that was in charge of all these aspects of his business that we had to now learn about, you know, streams of income and music rights and licensing and publishing and you know, very gnarly things. So thank God we had experts, but we, you know, gradually came up to speed so that we could help to run this company. So a few years later, we're now into the later 90s, my father's music licensor, Boozy and Hawks, came to us with this idea that they wanted permission from us to pursue. And they said, how would it be if somebody would develop a young people's concert, just like the ones Bernstein used to do himself on TV, except about him? And it would feature his music. And wouldn't this be a great way to introduce Bernstein to a new generation of young people? And it would be a really nice way to promote the Bernstein composition catalog, and we could offer this package to orchestras all around the country for their education outreach programs. How would that be? And we all said, yeah, that's a great idea. And my hand went up. I don't know why it went up. But I said, I volunteered to develop that concert. I had never done anything like that in my life. But for some reason, I felt like I could. But of course, you know, I was not a conductor or any kind of a trained musician, really. So I wasn't going to be able to do that part of things. So I called my friend, Michael Barrett, who had been my father's assistant conductor, knew all his music by heart, and was by now a friend of the family. And I said, okay, Mikey, here's what we're going to do. You're going to be the music guy, and I'll be the word guy. So I'll write the script, but you have to help me with all the musical examples, and you're going to conduct the concert. And then eventually, when we presented the concert, I was the narrator. That hadn't been my thought originally. I was just writing a narration for anybody to do, but I just kept hearing my own voice as I wrote. So I just kind of took to it like a duck to water, this narrating thing. And you know, for all the mishugas that I had about performing music, when it came to talking in front of people, it appears I don't have a problem doing that. I don't know why. It's like, I can talk in front of people. It's just a thing I can do. So I started narrating this concert called the Bernstein Beat, all about rhythm. And so that automatically steered us to all the jumpingest Bernstein music, you know, from West Side Story and Fancy Free and all this fun stuff that would make the kids bop around in their chairs, which I encouraged them to do. And the concert was a big hit. So eventually it made its way to Carnegie Hall. And the education people there said, hey, that was great. Now can you do us one about Mozart? Sure, we could do that. So we developed a concert about Mozart, big hit. Hey, that was great. Now can you do us one about Aaron Copland? Sure, we can give you one about Copland. And so over the years, not just with Carnegie Hall, but with all these other entities who were requesting concerts for various kinds of audiences, young and old, I wound up writing all these concert narrations. And, you know, 5 years went by, and I'm on the road more and more, and 10 years went by, 15, 18 years, and I'm constantly on the road, you know, narrating all these concerts and writing all these scripts. And I suddenly thought, hey, is this my career? And I guess it turned out to be my career, which just goes to show life can begin at 50, because that's around the age I was when this all began. And so as I've been going around doing these concert narrations and having so much fun doing it, it gradually occurred to me that I had found an inadvertent solution to my lifelong conundrum about music. I had found a way to stay in the world of music and do something useful, just not make the music with my own body. And then I was calmer, you see. So in the book, I describe it as cutting off the ailing limb to allow the rest of the organism to thrive. So I'm a kind of musical amputee, but I'm a very cheerful, pretty high-functioning amputee, and I love what I do. And, you know, I'm making myself useful and helping audiences enjoy the music more by giving them stuff to, I think of it as a roadmap, that you give people, you know, landmarks to spot as they're going along listening to the music so that they feel oriented in this music, so it's not just this assault of sound. So that's what I've been doing, and I love doing it. And it's really the next best thing to being a musician. I have a musician's life. I'm on the road, I'm at the rehearsals, I'm hanging out with my musician pals after the gig, you know, trading airport horror stories and all the things that musicians do. So it's been kind of a fantastic experience. And then my father's centennial arrived. And all these concerts that I had developed that were about my dad suddenly were in great demand, and I have been traveling like a maniac. So my father was born on August 25th, 1918. So the bullseye of the centennial was August 25th, 2018, about a year and a half ago. The whole thing began a year before that. And my brother and sister and I really wanted the centennial to be a nice big global celebration. as my sister said, it was our unrepeatable opportunity to remind the world of who our dad was and what he had contributed to our world. And so we alerted every entity, organization we could think of that the centennial was coming. But then after that, it was up to them to cook it up, right? So what we discovered was that Leonard Bernstein is the perfect guy for a centennial celebration because he was so multifaceted, right? So as a conductor, he left behind this incredible trove of audio and video recordings that were all reissued and they were on the airwaves everywhere you went. It was great. And then, of course, as a composer, he was so multifaceted. He wrote all those symphonic works. He wrote choral works. He wrote Broadway shows. He wrote ballets and operas and tons of different kinds of music. So there, every performing arts organization you can think of had something, a way to celebrate Leonard Bernstein. And then his legacy as an educator cannot be underestimated. To this very day, a significant percentage of the butts in seats of concert halls are there because they discovered music through the young people's concerts on television. You would not believe how often people come up to me from audiences and orchestras, and they'll say something like, I was raised in Podunk, Montana, and we didn't have live music, but I watched your father's concerts on TV, and that's how I fell in love with classical music, and that's why I'm here today in this audience, or playing the oboe in this orchestra. I hear it again and again and again. So it's a gigantic thing. And then, maybe the aspect of my father's legacy that I enjoy talking about the most is his lifelong work as an activist and a humanitarian. His whole life, he was all about tikkun olam, making the world a better place. And he did it every way he could, always. Starting in his 20s, he was already, lending his name to organizations, putting on benefit concerts, giving money to anybody that was doing something good in the world. Which is probably why, all the way back in the 1940s, the FBI was already keeping tabs on that Bernstein guy. What are all those lefty organizations he keeps joining anyway? And of course, in the 1950s, being a lefty was suddenly a big problem. But my father was always giving the FBI something to track. Then it was the civil rights movement, and then it was protesting the Vietnam War, and then it was no nukes, and then it was advocating for AIDS awareness. It was always something. So in the 1980s, through the Freedom of Information Act, my father could finally see his own FBI file. And that was when he found out that it was 800 pages long. I think it's a kind of badge of honor to have an 800-page FBI file. But it just goes to show, he knew that the FBI was tracking him all the time. He knew his phone was probably tapped, and he didn't care. And the message that we grew up with as a family was, if you see an injustice, you get out there and you make a noise. You hack a chinik. That great expression, hacking a chinik. Banging on a tea kettle. Make a noise. Protest. Say something. Don't just sit there and watch it all happen. So there was a kind of apotheosis for my father. I'm going to show the last clip now. When he, is it okay, or do you want to skip it? Of course. Okay, so in 1989, the year before my father died, the Berlin Wall came down. And my father was so thrilled about this, and he organized a performance of Beethoven's Ninth in Berlin. He did it twice, once on the west side and once on the east side. And it was broadcast on television on Christmas Day. And it was this glorious celebration of a good thing that happened in the world. And for that one time, he changed the words Ode to Joy to Ode to Freedom. Freude became Freiheit, just for that one day. He said, I think Beethoven wouldn't mind. So I'm just going to show you a little clip from that performance. And then we'll open it up to questions. Oh, yeah. Well, I'll try. If we can't get the volume any higher, I'm so sorry. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Well, that was absolutely terrific, and I can tell you that's just a tiny part of the book, which I hope that you will all read and have signed outside after this, and we'll have some questions here. I have to do one little job of my own now and just ask you, when you're out there, pick up a copy of our schedule of upcoming speakers and save the date of Sunday, February 2nd here at 10:30 a.m. for our next program, which will be Recreating Humanity, Moral Choices and Genetic Engineering, with two speakers, renowned futurist Jamie Metzel and the director of Columbia University's bioethics program, Robert Klitzman. Now, if only genetic engineers could figure out how to give everybody that Bernstein musical gene, that would really be amazing. But I will start off with a couple of questions of my own, and then we will have microphones going around for people to please ask questions but not make speeches, and so we can get in as many questions as possible. So my first question, being that we're here, and this is the Amram Scholar Series at Washington Hebrew, I would love to ask you, you haven't touched on your father's Judaism. Of course, your mother was born Catholic. And in addition to questions of faith and observance, if you could talk a little bit about sort of his relationship with God. I mean, he's struggled in many ways throughout his life, particularly you've noted after your mother died and the difficulties that he had within the marriage and you're dealing with his own demons. So if you could talk about both his Judaism and his faith.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for asking that question. So my father was raised in a very traditional, old world Jewish environment. Both his parents were from the Ukraine region, and so he had a very traditional, old world upbringing. And his first experience of music was in the synagogue. So that's the world he grew up in. But once he was old enough to make his own decisions, he evidently found his own way to express his spirituality. And my mother was raised Catholic in South America, and so when the two of them got married, I think they decided to carve their own idiosyncratic path. And I think for both of them, and of course for my father especially, his deepest spiritual inquiry happened in his music. And you can hear it in his music, and you can track his lifelong arguments with his spiritual creator all the way through his works. There are so many works where he seems to be, shaking his fist at the heavens. If you're up there taking care of us, why is everything such a mess down here? And why are we all so terrible to each other? And he asks that question a lot. So I think that's really where his spiritual focus was. In terms of religion at home, like many assimilated Jewish families in the US, we did a little of this, a little of that. We have our Christmas tree, we have our menorah, we have our giant rockin' seders, and a little egg hunt for the kids on Easter Sunday. So that's how that goes.
So in terms of the kind of demons that he was struggling with, you do spend a lot of time in the book discussing sort of a self-destructive streak in him that all of you worried about and had to try to save him from.
Which we could not do.
What?
We could not save him.
Right, tragically, and he died, far too young, only 72. And as you point out, a lot of that was sort of brought on by his lifestyle in many ways. If you could talk a little bit about that, because it is such an essential part of the book, the personality and the kinds of things, the addictions, the problems that he had.
Well, again, this is so much a story of the times that we were living in, because in the mid-20th century, doctors encouraged people with sleeping problems to take sleeping pills, and they were very generous with the amphetamines as well. So in my father's case, he was a terrible insomniac. He had a motor that he could not turn off. And the good part of that was that he got so much accomplished, and he was so, vibrant and everything, but he couldn't turn it off and go to sleep. And so he became dependent on sleeping pills early in his life. And then, what if he had a 10 a.m. rehearsal? Then he would take an amphetamine to help wake him up and give him the energy for that early morning activity. And so, when you're younger, you're able to tolerate the ping-ponging of these substances in your body. But as you get older, your body has a harder time tolerating those substances, and it starts to affect your health and even your personality. And so that really happened to my father. And in his last decade, he was really kind of starting to fall apart at the seams physically. And he just could not sustain this pace that he had devised for himself. And it was just the times he lived in that all of this way he was coping was encouraged. He had loads of pills. So that wasn't good. And there was a lot of alcohol consumption too, but that actually was sort of on the level that everybody was at in those days, where alcohol consumption was also very much, permitted and advocated, and so there was, a lot of scotch. He had the worst taste in scotch. He drank Ballantines, disgusting. I thought it tasted like medicine. So there was that as well. But of course, in the end, what got him were the cigarettes. And that also was highly advocated by the world that we lived in those days. So there you go.
And then the last question I will ask you and then throw it out is just so interesting. Jamie comes up with a definition or an understanding about the word conductor in the book, and in which you describe it as almost an electric loop. I wonder if you could just share that with the audience. It's so interesting.
Sure. Well, I had this realization one day that it's so perfect that they call the musical director of an orchestra a conductor, because it really is like an electrical current is going around between the musicians and the audience through the conductor, who helps that energy go around in a circle. And, not every conductor conducts in an electrical manner like my father did. I was really shocked when I finally saw Herbert von Karajan conduct. He barely moved, and his eyes were closed. It was like he was almost like in a coma. And yet he could elicit these tremendous performances out of the orchestra. So that really confused me, because I had bought into the idea that my father's every gesture was literally eliciting the performance that I was hearing. So I don't have the answer for any of that. I don't get how it works, but anyway.
And she described so well how that energy going through the orchestra then comes to the audience, and then the audience reaction comes back.
It goes in a circle.
And so that it's a constant sort of circle of energy.
It is a circuit, an electrical circuit of musical
So people will
energy.
raise their hands if they have questions. We'll bring you microphones to...
Okay, there's a lady back there who had her hand up from the get-go. So maybe we should start with you. Can you speak up?
Can you share a couple of the bits that you had to remove from the book?
Oh, the bits I had to remove. Okay. Well, the thing that I had to cut that broke my heart the very most was I had this idea that I wanted to have a joke appendix. And I wrote it. What I wanted to do was make reference to all those really resonant Jewish jokes that we all grew up with that are so meaningful, and they're so meaningful that you quote the punchlines and everybody knows what you're talking about. Like, schmuck buy a ticket. Do you know that one? You must know that joke. So, I'll tell it really fast. So every night, the guy prays to God, "Dear God, God, let me win the lottery. Please, God, let me win the lottery." So for 20 years, he makes this prayer, and then one day, the heavens open, and there's a bolt of lightning, and a great voice says, "Schmuck, help me a little. Buy a ticket." Stuff like that. So anyway, I wrote out all these jokes. And Jonathan, my editor, said, "I hate to tell you this, but when you write the jokes down, they're not that funny. It's an oral tradition." Oh, so I had to cut the joke appendix.
Tell the joke that your grandfather said when asked why he at first objected to your father studying music.
Oh, this isn't a joke. This is a true story. So, my grandfather, Sam, he immigrated to the United States at the age of 17 without a kopeck in his pocket, classic immigrant success story. He worked and strove and toiled and slaved until he had his own successful hair and beauty supply business in Boston. And so the cherry on top of his immigrant success story was going to be when he could hand his successful business over to his eldest son, Leonard, to run. So you can imagine his horror when, at age 14, his eldest son, Leonard, announced he wanted to be a musician. A musician? And back in the old country, a musician was like this vagrant, this bum with a beat-up fiddle who would trudge from shtetl to shtetl and say, you got a wedding? You got a bar mitzvah? Saw away a little and get a couple of coins and a bowl of soup, and then trudge to the next town. You got a wedding, a bar mitzvah. So you call that a living? You know, that's not why Sam went through what he went through, so that so that his son would be a klezmer. So he was so hell-bent on discouraging his son from pursuing this cockamamie musician idea that for a while he wouldn't even pay for my father's piano lessons. Years later, after my father had this big overnight success as a conductor, some journalist got wind of this story and confronted my grandfather. Mr. Bernstein, is it true that you wouldn't pay for your son's piano lessons? And my grandfather immortally replied, well, how was I supposed to know he'd turn out to be Leonard Bernstein? True story. Yes?
Comment a bit more on his mentor role, particularly, for example, with Michael Tilson Thomas and his relationship with the great Michael
Right.
Tilson Thomas.
Well, the question was my father's role as a mentor for so many musicians. I mean, as I told you, he was a compulsive teacher. And so teaching younger people, sharing knowledge was his favorite thing on earth. And one of his earliest musical experiences was to attend Tanglewood as a student, a conducting student, at the very beginning when Tanglewood first began its program of student orchestra. And my father had such a fantastic time there that when he got older, he kept going back to Tanglewood, but now he was on the other side of the equation as a teacher. And that was his favorite thing in life, was to go to Tanglewood and teach the kids and stay up all night banging on the piano and singing songs and having rap sessions and talking about philosophy and history, and that was his idea of heaven. And so later on in his life, he actually founded 2 music festivals that were inspired by Tanglewood. And one is in Schleswig-Holstein, Germany, and the other one is in Sapporo, Japan. So his legacy as a mentor goes on, which is great. Yes?
Where did you learn your Yiddish, and was it spoken in your
Oh, well, I wish I knew more Yiddish than I do, but I really love the little that I know. We didn't speak Yiddish at home, but there were a lot of Yiddish expressions and words being tossed around all the time. So, life was just sprinkled with these great Yiddishisms, and it's just the most yummy, colorful, expressive language. It's just fabulous. So every chance I get, I try to use it, keep it vibrant. Yes?
So, Jamie, I'm a psychotherapist. So I'm so curious about you because you're describing the magnitude of the richness and the gifts of your life, and also these devastating losses and woven in with the addiction, the sexual, ambivalence. I'm wondering, did you get help to become the person that you are and to move into the center?
Oh, yeah.
Did everybody hear the question?
I got help. When I was very unhappy in college, that was my first go-round with a psychiatrist. And I must say he was of minimal assistance. And then later on, I had a wonderful psychiatrist who was also very helpful in my father's last year. We kind of went to him for advice, and he was wonderful. So, yeah, over the years, we've all had our share of shrinks, and my father had many psychiatrists, and he grew up in the Freudian age when you went into analysis. And I mean, I don't know what kind of psychiatry you practice, but...
Licensed clinical social worker.
Okay, so not Freudian analysis, but I think of Freudian analysis now and I think, did people really do this? They went in every single day to talk at the wall with the person who didn't say anything? What? So anyway, it just seems a little antiquated to me now. Yes?
Your sister and your brother, what are they doing?
Oh, my sister and my brother. So Alexander, he helped put together, he's a teacher by profession, and is very interested in aspects of education. And he invented a teaching model based on our father's philosophies of education. It's called artful learning. And artful learning is the coolest thing. It's being used in a lot of schools around the US. It's not just let's put arts in the schools. It's much more. It's actually using the spirit of creativity to infuse the entire school curriculum and connect all the subjects to each other in this really fantastically inventive way. The teachers love it, the kids love it. They always have to create something to express what they've learned in the given class that they're taking. And so, you know, when you create something to express what you've learned, you don't forget what you learned because you internalized it and then expressed it in your own way. And so these kids, the scores go up and they get into great colleges and they remember everything they learned. And it just fills them with a love of learning. So it's hot stuff. So that's what Alexander's doing. And then my sister is a chef, which is very nice for us on the holidays. Oh, such a brisket she makes on the Seder, you wouldn't believe. So she was actually working in a program in inner city high schools explaining about what food is and how to prepare it. And she would bring all the equipment and all the ingredients, and then the kids would cook and discover how to do it, and then turn around and mentor little kids about it in the summers and get paid for it. It was a great program. But she took off from that to be, during the centennial year, to be, as she put it, a professional Bernstein, because we all had so much to do during the centennial.
I have one question, since I have a microphone.
That's almost unfair.
Can you talk a little bit about your parents' relationship with the Black Panthers and their notoriety as cultural figures in New York?
The Black Panther thing. This would actually be a whole other conversation that we can have some other day. But very briefly put, you've probably all heard about the book that Tom Wolfe wrote called Radical Chic, and about how everybody thinks my father gave a party for the Black Panthers. That is not what happened. My mother gave a fundraising event to help the families of these 21 Black Panther members who were waiting for their trial, to help the families survive until the Panthers could get out of jail. And the minute the trial started, the judge threw it out because it was completely bogus. It was nothing. But, that's what happened back in those days. So it was my mother's fundraising event, and no press was invited. But Tom Wolfe sneaked in. He stole David Halberstam's invitation off his desk at New York Magazine. Fact! We only found this out like 2 or 3 years ago.
And Charlotte Curtis.
And Charlotte Curtis, the society editor of the New York Times, she sneaked in because a family friend lived in her building and was on her way to the thing. She said, "Hey, why don't you come with me? I'm going to the Bernsteins for this thing." That's how she got in, because there was not supposed to be any press there. Anyway, I'm spending the rest of my life correcting the record on this incident, which fomented so much vitriol and misunderstanding, and it was so bad for my mother especially, because she was humiliated by the reaction that she had to what was basically, she was just trying to do something good for some people who were in trouble. So that's all I'll say for now. If you have more questions, you can ask me later.
Alan?
In December of 1997, the Kennedy Center Honors awarded, one of the awardees was Charlton Heston. And one of the songs that was sung to him was from one of your father's productions, 1600. Okay? And the song was Bless this
Take care of this house.
house. The words are so meaningful that it brought tears to Charlton Heston's face.
Yep, well, to all of us. So this gentleman is referring to a song from my father's flop musical, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But this song has had a life of its own, and the words are kind of devastating. I'll just recite them for you. When you hear this song, it's a lot. And in the show, Abigail Adams sings it to this little boy who's coming to work in the White House. Take care of this house, keep it from harm. If bandits break in, sound the alarm. Care for this house, shine it by hand, and keep it so clean the glow can be seen all over the land. Be careful at night, check all the doors. If someone makes off with the dream will be yours. Take care of this house, be always on call, for this house is the hope of us all. Alan J. Lerner.
I think that's probably a terrific point and a message to leave us with, because that was absolutely beautiful. Well, thank you so very much for this.
Thank you
fantastic
all.
performance.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you. See you out there.
Jamie will be signing books in the lobby, so you'll have a chance to speak with her personally, and I hope you will.